I don't know what it was about 2024, but I got food poisoning 4 times last year, which is more times than in my entire life before 2024. I'll tell the story of each time here in the hope that you learn from my experience so you can avoid food poisoning on your own travels and know what to do if you do get sick. Now, don't worry, I'll spare you all the graphic details, but one of my stories does involve me having a psychedelic trip while sitting on a toilet. So if that makes you uncomfortable, then feel free to turn off my video. The first time was in Taiwan, which I suspect was from a bento box I ate while taking a high speed rail. By the way, I say suspect because depending on the contaminant, whether it's bacterial or viral or something else, it can take anywhere from a few hours to several days after infection to start showing symptoms, so it's hard to be sure what exactly got me sick. All I can do is make an informed guess. Anyways, for those that don't know, bento box is a Japanese lunch box that typically consists of rice, a protein, and some veggies. Taiwan has their own version, which is called biendang in Mandarin Chinese, and the Taiwanese railway biendang, which is typically meant to be served and eaten on a train, has become its own brand with an almost cult-like following, with standalone shops and even an annual festival. I guess these biendangs are normally meant to be eaten for lunch only, because I was catching an evening train, and before boarding, I made a quick stop at a biendang stand, and they literally only had one biendang left, and both me and this old guy got there at the same time, and I said he could have it, but he insisted that I take it. Now I'm not going to argue with an old man, so I bought it, got on my train, and ate it. Now I noticed the biendang was very lukewarm, basically room temperature, so it must have been sitting around the entire day, and even though it was covered, it probably wasn't enough to prevent bacterial growth. So that night is when the symptoms started, where I woke up in the middle of the night and had a general sense of discomfort and could not fall back asleep. It's hard to describe exactly what I was feeling. It wasn't so much pain or aches, but more like my entire body feeling extremely sensitive, where just the weight of the clothes on my body and my body weight on the bed felt extremely uncomfortable, making for a very restless night. But by daytime is when the symptoms really started ramping up, with body aches, headaches, fever, cold sweats, and of course, frequent bathroom trips. Basically, it felt like I was dying, and I was bedridden the entire day. And on a scale of 1 to 10, I probably rate the intensity a 9. But interestingly, by the second day, I was much better, with the intensity down to maybe a 3, where I still felt a bit fatigued, but at least well enough to work again. And I remember on that day, I was scheduled to present at an online conference. Unfortunately, I was able to get through with no issues. And then by the third day, I was almost completely recovered with the intensity down to maybe a 1. So this type of food poisoning, which I basically felt like I'm dying the first day, but much better the second day, I'll call type A to differentiate from the other types I'll get later. So the lesson from this story is be very wary of eating food that's been left out for an extended period of time. The US FDA specifies 2 hours as the maximum time perishable food should be left out, but of course, when traveling overseas, other countries may not abide by US FDA regulations. Second time I got food poisoning was in Malaysia in a city called Kuching, capital of the state of Sarawak on the Borneo side of Malaysia. One evening, I was taking a walk along the Sarawak River, enjoying the nice views, and ducked into an open air food court to eat some cheap local food. This was a local food court and not one catering to cashed up tourists, so while the food may be cheap and tasty, the food hygiene may be a bit questionable. It wasn't that busy, with probably more cats than people roaming around, and you can see that one of them joined me for my meal. By the way, the name of the city, Kuching, means cat in Malay, so it's no surprise there were a lot of cats around. While I was eating my meal, though, it started raining torrentially, and I didn't have an umbrella, and even if I did, it probably wouldn't have helped much anyways, so I just stayed inside and waited out the storm. There wasn't much to do other than eat, and even though I'd already finished my meal, I let my ADD get the best of me and ordered a couple extra dishes, including a green vegetable called midden. Now, midden is quite a popular dish in Sarawak, but only in Sarawak because it's only grown there, and it's extremely perishable and has to be cooked the same day it's picked, which basically makes it impossible to export anywhere. The midden itself tasted fine, especially for the price. And eventually, the storm passed and I made it back to my hotel. But that night is when the symptoms started, same as before in Taiwan. So basically, I went through the same type A food poisoning as before. Now, I don't know exactly what caused the food poisoning. It could have been one, since midden is so perishable, the vegetable itself might have already gone bad since it was picked, especially since it was close to the end of the day when I ate it. Or two, the heavy rains were causing stormwater runoff, which impacted the water used to cook the vegetable. Or three, just poor food hygiene practices, especially with all the cats roaming around. It could have been one of these, a combination of these, or something entirely else. I can't know for sure. So I don't really know what the lesson here is, other than to say, beware of vegetable. And according to a study by Consumer Reports in the US, leafy greens are actually the food most likely to cause food poisoning due to potential contamination from irrigation water or during processing. So it's not just midden you need to worry about. So even though there was a sign by the Sarawak River warning me of crocodiles, it was actually green vegetables I should have been afraid of. The third time I got sick was when I was in Turkmenistan, although I suspect the infection occurred in Vietnam while I was transiting through Ho Chi Minh City on my way to Ashgabat, the capital of Turkmenistan. If you've never heard of Turkmenistan, it is one of the least visited countries in the world, as it's quite a heavily controlled single party state similar to North Korea. So tourists can only visit as part of an organized tour. You can't just go on your own. The quirkiness of Turkmenistan can be a whole separate video, and I won't get into all of that now, but it has one of the largest natural gas reserves in the world, and one of the main tourist attractions is what's known as the Crater to Hell, which is a giant crater in the desert that's been burning nonstop for the past 40 or so years due to all the natural gas there. So I started feeling sick the day we were supposed to head out to the Crater to Hell, which was day 4 of our tour. But interestingly, the symptoms were a bit different from the previous type A food poisoning. I still had the same restlessness and discomfort the first night, but rather than be bedridden the next day, I was at least able to get up and move when I needed to. So overall, the symptoms weren't quite as intense. But it was still quite an adventure getting to the crater, which was a good 6 hour drive from the city, including through extremely poorly maintained roads and sand dunes towards the end. In fact, the roads were so bad, our driver would instead choose to drive through the sand instead of the road. It was a very bumpy ride to say the least. My other tour mates were shocked that I was somehow able to get through that without puking. Fortunately, one of my tour mates gave me some antibiotics he brought with him, which I think helped keep the symptoms manageable that day. But he actually had to leave the tour early for work reasons. So after arriving and seeing the crater for a couple hours, he had a private transfer take him another 6 hours through the night straight to the airport. And then the rest of us spent that night in a yurt camp, which by some miracle had sitting toilets. Now, I can't tell you how grateful I was to see that, because this place is literally in the middle of nowhere, and I was expecting the toilet to just be a hole in the ground or squat toilet at best. But let's just say I made very good use of that sitting toilet that night, and the yurts were made to be shared between two people. But actually, my roommate was supposed to be the guy that left early, so at least I had the yurt to myself and didn't need to constantly wake him up with my very frequent bathroom trips. But the bad news is, because the guy who left was the one who gave me antibiotics, I guess by the next day, the antibiotics wore off, so the symptoms started coming back, and it probably took me a good 5 to 6 days to fully recover. And this was towards the end of my Turkmenistan trip, so I was sick during my long journey back home. So this type of food poisoning, where the symptoms do not start out as intense, but overall take longer to recover from, I'll call type B. I asked ChatGPT why I had these two different responses to food poisoning, and it said type A was likely caused by preformed toxins from bacteria, and type B was likely caused by live bacteria. It seems both were bacteria related, which suggests antibiotics would help in both cases, but more on that later. Now, in terms of what caused it, the most obvious answer would be something I ate in Turkmenistan. But I was traveling as part of a tour group, and no one else from my group got sick. And we all generally ate the same thing, or at least ate at the same restaurants. So what I suspect then was it was from a bowl of beef pho I had at a hole in the wall place outside Ho Chi Minh Airport as I was waiting for my flight to Turkmenistan. I guess I didn't learn my previous lesson of beware of vegetable, as I suspect the contamination came from those bean sprouts and basil that normally get served as a side with the beef pho. And I know I didn't start feeling sick until 4 or 5 days after eating the pho, but according to John Hopkins, symptoms can start anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 weeks after eating contaminated food. So the lesson here, other than beware of vegetable again, is to always have some antibiotics handy while you're traveling, which can help not just for food poisoning, but for bacterial infections in general. But of course, if your food poisoning is from a viral infection, then antibiotics won't help. And the fourth and last time I got sick in 2024 was right at the end, during those few days between Christmas and New Year's. I was traveling from Morocco to Spain and started feeling sick the first day I arrived in Spain. At first, I thought it was just seasickness, as I wasn't feeling great on the more than 3 hour ferry ride, and the waters were actually quite rough that day, to the point that the fast ferry I initially booked got cancelled, and I was forced to take a taxi to a different ferry port 50 kilometers away to catch the big slow ferry. And when I finally made it to the city of Seville in Spain, the classic initial symptoms of fatigue, weakness, and even numbness started kicking in. The numbness was a new one. So again, I didn't think it was food poisoning and didn't feel it was necessary to take antibiotics. But by the next day, it became quite clear to me that this was indeed another case of type B food poisoning. What I suspect caused it was this little hole in the wall eatery in Chefchaouen, a mountain town in Morocco famous for being blue. And when I say blue, I mean the town was literally painted blue to attract tourists. The main square in Chefchaouen is full of your typical tourist restaurants with touts outside, all trying to convince you to go to their restaurant. And generally, I try to avoid overly touristic places, so I ducked into some alleys and found a hole in the wall eatery which had a local mom and pop vibe to it. I ordered a chicken tagine, which was really good, but I remember the cutlery and bowl it was served in being a bit dirty. But also, I remember the bathroom was quite clean, and with a sitting toilet, which I didn't expect for such a small restaurant. And usually, they say you can tell how clean a kitchen is by how clean the bathroom is, so I'm surprised their food preparation hygiene wasn't better. But don't let this discourage you from visiting Chef Choin. I would say it was probably the highlight of my trip to Morocco. Anyways, back to Spain where the symptoms were hitting me hard. Now, the problem was by this point, I'd missed my window to take antibiotics, as they're supposed to be taken with food, and I pretty much had no appetite at this point and could not keep any food down. Now, the dramatic part was, I had booked a psychedelic experience in Spain, and I was really on the fence about canceling it. But in the end, I thought, it doesn't matter if I cancel it or not, I'll still be sick, so I decided to go through with it. Now, if you don't know, psychedelics are basically hallucinogenic drugs such as magic mushrooms or MDMA, which in the past might have been seen as illegal and potentially harmful recreational drugs. But there's been a lot of emerging research lately on the benefits of psychedelics, including for mental and emotional health and treating issues such as depression, anxiety, and PTSD, but also to help spark new ways of thinking. For example, Steve Jobs famously said that taking psychedelics was one of the most profound experiences of his life. So, what the heck is it like having a psychedelic trip while sick with food poisoning? Well, let's first talk about what it's like normally when you're not sick. Now, everyone responds to psychedelics differently, and each person will also have a different experience each time they take psychedelics. And for me, this wasn't my first time, so I kind of already knew what to expect. So, the last time I took psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, I basically got taken on this very long, winding journey of consciousness. So, I guess they called it trip for a reason, because you really do feel like you're going on a trip. So, basically, it's like, a thought will pop into my head just like it normally would, but then the drugs would kind of take over and essentially take those thoughts and bring me on this journey of consciousness where I start thinking and about things and seeing things in ways I never have before. And it just goes on this long winding journey deeper and deeper and deeper into different levels of consciousness. And that's where you can get these really deep, profound insights. So I'm not surprised when some people say that taking psychedelics is one of the most meaningful experiences of their life. But taking psilocybin while sick with food poisoning was a very different experience. So what happened was I would take the psilocybin, and once it started to kick in, I would feel, my thoughts trying to go on that winding journey. But then as soon as it would start to go on that journey, the pain and discomfort and stomach cramps from the food poisoning would kick in and essentially snap me back to reality. So essentially the pain and discomfort would distract me from my journey and snap me back to my baseline point. And it was just a recurring cycle of trying to go down this journey of consciousness, but being snapped back from the pain, trying to go down and being snapped back from the pain. So I wasn't really able to go on that long, winding journey and get down to those deep levels of consciousness that I was able to before. And then after a couple hours, I could no longer ignore all the stomach cramping and had to make a beeline to the toilet, where I ended up spending the next few hours for the remainder of my trip. Now, I mentioned before that psilocybin basically takes you on this journey of consciousness where you don't have full control of your thoughts. Well, also, you don't have full control of your actions. Or maybe I'll start with a gesture, like putting my hands on my face, and then the psilocybin will take over, and I might start rubbing my hands all over my face, just being overly fascinated with the way it feels. Now, while I was on the toilet, fortunately, I had the foresight to know that as long as I was still tripping, I might not be in full control of where I put my hands. So I made a decision to not wipe until after I finished tripping. So there I was, sitting on a toilet for a good 3 hours, just tripping and waiting until I sobered up enough to finally wipe and finish the job. I remember just laughing at the absurdity of it, because I could either cry over what a miserable experience I was having or laugh at the absurdity. And at least for me, being on psilocybin tends to make everything funny. So in the end, I didn't get any deep insights or epiphanies, and at least I didn't crap myself, but I definitely would not recommend taking psychedelics while sick with food poisoning. That's a bit too obvious of a lesson. So actually, the more important takeaway here is that do not wait to take antibiotics. Take them as soon as you start to suspect bacterial food poisoning and while you can still keep food down. But that's assuming antibiotics are the right course of treatment for your type of food poisoning, which is up to your doctor to assess. Now, I know this video was supposed to be about 2024, but while writing the script in January 2025, I ended up getting food poisoning yet again, for the fifth time in less than 12 months. Now, the origin of this food poisoning is a bit more gross, but if you made it this far, then I'm sure you can stomach it. So, this was in Thailand on the island of Koh Samui, the second largest island in Thailand and a popular beach vacation destination. I went to this pretty shabby looking beachside cafe and ordered myself a chicken pad thai. I was eating it, and maybe 3/4 of the way through, when suddenly I noticed a hair in my food. But let's just say it was not the typical straight hair that might have fallen from someone's head, but hair of the curly variety. It was so gross that my mind went into a state of denial, and I had to convince myself it wasn't what it looked like, just so I wouldn't throw up on the spot. When a waiter came over to clear my table, I mentioned what I had found, and he was like, "Oh, you should have told us sooner, and we would have made you another one." But I can't really do that after having almost finished the whole thing, and even if I didn't, I pretty much had lost my entire appetite at that point and would have no interest in eating another pad thai. Also, I don't know if I'm overanalyzing this, but if I didn't see the hair until I was 3/4 finished, then that means the hair was essentially at the bottom of my dish, which means that it would have fallen in not at the end of the cooking process, where it would have been at the top and therefore only mildly contaminated the food, but fallen in towards the beginning, where it probably got nice and mixed and stir fried with everything else, spreading the bacteria everywhere. Gross. What was funny was, sitting next to me was a group of British tourists, talking amongst themselves. And then when a waiter came over and I was telling him about what I found, they all went quiet to eavesdrop on my conversation. And then when the waiter left, they all went back to talking in their polite, well mannered British way. But then when I got up to leave, they all looked at me without saying anything. At that point, they hadn't received their food yet, but I can picture them afterwards, all quietly checking their food for irregularly shaped hairs. Just a few hours after the meal, I started getting hit with the initial symptoms of the type B food poisoning, mainly the fatigue, weakness, and body sensitivity. And because I'd literally just recovered from food poisoning in Spain just a couple weeks earlier, I knew I had to get ahead of it this time and start going on antibiotics while I still had an appetite. And that's what I did. And while I still felt a bit crappy the next few days, I managed to avoid the more serious type of symptoms that would have kept me glued to the toilet. So the bonus lesson from my 2025 story is beware of curly hairs. So what experiences have you had with food poisoning? And do you have any tips on how not to get sick or what to do if you do get sick? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you next time.